All righty. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. Today, in our all things queer liberation, we welcome somebody I've been wanting to talk to for a very long time. We welcome Laura Miles, a socialist organizer, a trade unionist organizer, a queer liberationist leftist, an associate of the Socialist Workers Party, and she is the author of the brilliant, superb, incredible book, Transgender Resistance, Socialism and the Fight for Trans Liberation. And yes, without further ado, let's get into it. So firstly, Miss Miles, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the... Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the program today.
No, thank you for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you.
It's it's a real honor to have you. And actually, just before I get to my first question, actually talk to the audience a bit about your background, because in preparation for this, I was actually rewatching one of your lectures at the Socialist Workers Party event, and you know the person who was reading out your bio talked about your background in the trade union. So yeah, so talk to us a bit about your background before we talk about.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Well, thanks for the build up. Yeah, I was I came out in about 2000, roughly 2000, year 2000, I guess, to friends and family. I was already actually a socialist then and a trade union activist, had been for some time. I was a college lecturer, so I was in the College Lecturers Union. I was subsequently, some years later, I think, I think, the first person, certainly in the UK, first trans person elected to the national executive of it's changed its name. It became the University and College Union, and I was on that. I was on that executive for quite a few years, actually, right up until a couple of years ago. I'm retired now, because I'm actually very old. But yeah, I spent a number of years, and I was for some of that time, I was the chair of the union's National Equality Committee as well. So I have a background in, both in terms of general kind of trade union activism, if you like, the
And in
fighting for better
education.
pay, all that. Yeah, exactly, absolutely, and fighting for decent education, but also in terms of trying to promote LGBT plus rights within the workplace, within the trade union movement. So I was involved in developing materials for use in workplaces, that kind of stuff, really. Yes,
Fantastic.
so
Well,
that's what I was
fantastic.
doing.
And fantastic. In fact, a two-time past guest on this program, Tim McCaskill, a very well-known queer liberationist leftist in Canada. His background is also in not just fighting heteronormativity, but also in education, stuff like that. So I've been wanting to do a series of interviews on education. So I'm gonna have to. So I'm gonna have to get you back on the program to talk about education. Why the right wing is so determined to make education this bizarre,
Yes.
labyrinth game of and stuff like that. But before we talk about transphobia and whatnot, briefly, if you can you talk about yes, briefly, if you can you talk about, before we talk about, the new about transphobia, the new wave of attacks on your people, can you explain to our audience, especially, straight cis, the straight cisgender ones, what is heteronormativity, its relations to capitalism, and even settler colonialism? When we talk about, heteronormativity and all of the evils that comes with that.
Well, yes, a brief answer. Gosh, I would,
If
I,
possible.
yeah. Well, I'd argue that heteronormativity is kind of it's fundamental, really, to the capitalist system. It's rooted within the capitalist system, which is one reason why, when I'm in the book, for example, and in other, articles and publications, I've always stressed the difference between fighting for our rights and fighting for liberation. You can fight for your rights, and absolutely any oppressed group, should and has to do that. You have no choice, really, to fight for better rights in the system as we know it. But in terms of actually winning, genuine liberation, in which we're able to be who we are without, constantly having to look over our shoulder if the system goes into crisis, etc., etc., then, that actually requires addressing the nature of the system that we live in. And I would certainly argue that, the ideology, if you like, of heteronormativity is absolutely rooted within the system which is based on production for profit. The sort of social relations of production that arise from that, and the social relations of reproduction as well, are really underpinned massively by notions of, quotes, normality, whether that's the gender binary ideology, or heteronormativity, and so on. So it's actually very much a kind of, transphobia, and resisting transphobia, it seems to me, is very much a class question, not just in terms of that it impacts working class trans people, much more directly and seriously than those who can afford, to, I don't know, to sort of go the private route, if you like. But it also, in terms of, it is in the interests of the working class generally, and workers generally, to fight, not just just the same way as fighting and struggling against racism or anti-Semitism and so on. It's in the interests of the class to fight against transphobia as well, because otherwise you allow, an ideological wedge to be driven into the potential solidarity between groups of people, which is not in the interest of the working class. It's in the interest of the ruling class, who it makes it much easier for them to govern and to continue to exploit our labour, etc., etc. That's as brief as I could make it, Youri. Sorry.
We'll definitely probably be revisiting that more and more throughout the conversation. But that's a perfect segue to this question, which is, why do you think, or how do you explain the growing rise or further rise in transphobia at a legislative level, the hate crime level, and just the expressions of transphobia that we see that we see in mainly corporates, in corporate state media, and because a lot of this really kicked off in the country you're based in, Britain, and I have I have a theory why why transphobia seems to be the new fashionable bigotry, but I'm curious your response to that question.
Right. Yes. I mean, you're right up to a point. It did kick off here, although it actually was picked up pretty quickly by sections of the right and the far right in North America as well. But I mean, if you want the kind of, where did it come from in the UK? It's interesting actually, because we've had a conservative, increasingly right-wing conservative government since 2010, and a huge drive to austerity in the wake of the financial crisis of 2008 to 2009. And yet, that Tory government, up until Prime Minister Theresa May, and including Prime Minister Theresa May, was actually in favour of outlawing conversion therapy, for instance, for gay people and trans, for all LGBT plus people, but also was in favour of self-ID, self-recognition, to change the Gender Recognition Act. I don't think you've got anything, any federal legislation, that mirrors what we have. I may be wrong on that in the US, but we have a Gender Recognition Act which was passed in 2004, became effective in 2005. It's a bit out of, it's, what is it, getting on for 20 years old now. It's a bit out of date, and there have been attempts, or proposals really, from trans groups, LGBT groups, to amend it so that instead of having to go through quite a torturous process, lengthy process, and a medicalized, pathologized process to get what's called a gender recognition certificate, which would then allow you, it's the only thing you can get that will allow you to change your birth certificate, because you can change all your other documentation, you just can't change your birth certificate. You would, instead of that, medicalized process. You know, you have to wait 2 years. It's a faceless panel that makes the decision and all this kind of stuff. You would make essentially a legal declaration that you are going to live in this gender from now on, blah, 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 blah. Up until about 5 years ago, even the Tory party, the Conservative Party, was actually supporting that. It wasn't until um, lobbying by various gender critical groups that had emerged around about 2015, 2016, that they changed their line on this. And I mean, I can talk about that later if you like. That's all to do with the growing nature of the crisis and so on and so forth, you know. But the particular trigger in Britain was proposals from one of the parliamentary committees to make about 30 changes, 30 recommendations, having had a long-term survey of trans people's lives and finding out they were pretty shitty and quite difficult. They came out with it's the women and it was the Women's Equality Committee made up of MPs from various parties and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things they proposed was changing the Gender Recognition Act to include self-identification, and that
People
began very
and,
the opposition.
and self-identification. That's people who come out saying that they want to change their gender and are in the process of changing their genders.
It's a well, it's a specific wish as part of transition, really. I mean, not some people transition in different ways, don't they? Some partially transition, other people transition and never bother or never want to get a gender recognition certificate. They're not bothered about changing their birth certificate and so on. For other trans people, it's a really major issue because, of course, if you've got a birth certificate that says a different name and a different registered sex to how you're living your life currently, there's always the potential to be outed because these are kind of public documents, and you can be outed, and you may have been living your life for decades in the gender to which you aspire, and that can be deeply damaging. So some people do want it, and self-ID was, as I say, this proposal really, or to change the way in which you could bring that about. And when the parliamentary committee came out and said, right, well, we have these recommendations, including moving to self-identification, that's when the first of the kind of gender critical groups began to organise in the UK. And we have now a whole plethora of them, I have to say, just like elsewhere in the world. And they've moved on, frankly. They've moved on from just opposing the introduction of self-identification for the Gender Recognition Act. They now want to change the Equality Act, which is a fundamental piece of legislation that includes protections for trans people. That was passed in 2010. And they want to use that. They want to make those changes in order to then legally prevent trans people and non-binary people, I guess, as well, from accessing what they call, women's spaces, changing rooms, bathrooms, hospital wards, the prison system, and so on and so forth. In about 2018, 2019, the Tory party changed its position and came out against that, against self-ID. And it's now got to the stage where I'm afraid even the Labour Party in Britain is now equivocating on the issue, and is not, fully on board with supporting trans people's rights in that regard. So it kind of escalated from there. I think in the US, it was very conscious, actually. The decision to attack trans rights was a very conscious political and ideological move by organizations on the right who had kind of lost the argument by that point on particularly on questions of same-sex marriage, gay adoption, and so on. And they very consciously, Mel Kilgallen and people like that, very consciously said, look, what's the weak link in terms of LGBT rights and lives? And they felt that trans was the weak link. If they could drive a wedge into the LGBT movement by attacking trans people, they could more easily build a side for attacking LGB rights in general, and of course women's rights, because these are the same sorts of people who were cheering on and organizing to overturn Roe v. Wade. They're exactly the same people. And so there's a different kind of slightly different history in North America, I think, to the European history. And it's very much associated, I'm sure it is in both countries or both continents actually. Primarily, it's associated with the right and the far right and their notions of protection of the family and all this stuff about protecting women and children. And I mean, one of the slogans that we face here, around Drag Queen Story Hour is, sorry, these big banners that sort of protect our children, stop the trans groomers, this kind of business. But of course, it's associated. I mean, the EU rapporteur on equality, LGBT equality, a couple of years ago, there was a very interesting report. He identified 4 countries which were particularly bad and had gone backwards on the question of LGBT plus rights, and particularly trans rights. That was Hungary, Poland, Russia, and I'm afraid the UK as well. And of course, in the US, things have got pretty bad I mean, it's polarized, isn't it? Many states, ex-Confederate states in the Midwest, seem to be particularly bad.
Call them ex-Confederates, we call them neo-Confederates. but that's fascinating because I think because this is my theory. Because I wanted to tell you, my theory why I think transphobia is this. And transphobia has always been there, but it's just in recent years it really is becoming like the new fashionable form of bigotry that the right and even unfortunately the left engage in. And my theory why I think it particularly kicked off in Britain is this. Now, I know some of your comrades at the SWP were supportive of Brexit, what they called a Lexit, and I don't want to reopen that, so we'll put that issue aside for another day. But the fact of the matter is that the far right really latched on to Brexit, engaged in a very xenophobic campaign, something that was going on in Britain for a long time. The move to get Britain out of the European Union, but so that Britain could pursue more reactionary far right politics, voodoo economics. And I think now that Brexit is done, now that Brexit is done, the Daily Mail, the Sun, and all of those other far right newspapers. It could be the Daily Express, even Spiked Online, which is the new kind of hipster right wing populist outlets. Now that so now that Brexit is done, you can't really scapegoat EU migrants anymore. You can't even scapegoat the EU for all the problems Britain is having. So what can we do to unite our people? What can we do to try to get some bigoted left-wing people to get them distracted from the woes of the economy, because and so forth. So what can we so what's a new group that we can marginalize, otherize trans people for a lot of obvious reasons, because a lot of people simply don't understand transgenderism, non-binaryism, even intersex. For many people, even those who claim that they're tolerant of the queer community, that still is one that they have a hard time wrapping their heads around. Ergo, this is why, in particular, Britain, the transphobia industry kicked off. And I'm curious your response to. I'm curious your response to that.
Yeah, I mean, yes, there is a excuse me, there is an argument for a left Brexit position,
Yeah,
which we can't have here. But I mean, you're right. I mean, it was dominated by the right, and it ties into their ideological position. I think transphobia is only one of two particular targets in the UK, and the other one is very clearly migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers, and that has been very deliberately stoked up uh, by by the Conservatives, some of whom, by the way, have migrant backgrounds themselves. I mean,
I
you know,
know, I know. It's bizarre.
yes,
Yeah, yeah,
it is kind of, well, class is dominant, isn't it? They're operating in the interests of their own class, not the interests of their ethnic background. But
exactly.
that is the really, if you like, the really big one where they're trying to whip up um, hostility and divide people. And we are constantly, those of us on the left, who are active anti-racist and anti-fascist, are constantly, having to organise to prevent, as far as we can, that kind of taking off in a bigger way than it has done. But the other group is quite clearly trans, and you can you can hardly open a newspaper, to be honest, or turn the radio or the television on without there being some item, generally hostile, um, about trans people. And very rarely do you come across trans voices in this. I mean, the right like to claim they're being silenced all the time. When trans people argue back, they don't like being argued back, do they? These people, um, but it's actually trans voices that are not heard. You know, I've lost count of the number of interviews I've heard on the radio, and the TV, where they talk about trans people, but never to trans people. But as I say, that is certainly a group, and it's important.
Is that very similar to kind of Romophobia, where there's always some xenophobic article or some xenophobic conversation about the Roma people are doing this, the Roma people are doing that, without even talking to somebody from that background, a representative of that background, to even to even push back against that. So that's the same thing that we see
Absolutely,
with trans
absolutely, yeah. Well, it's true of any oppressed group to some extent, isn't it? And talking about race and racism and not talking to black and brown people, it's very, 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 very common, but it's blatant in relation to trans people, and it's been going on for a long time. So that a whole series of misconceptions, lies, become kind of commonly accepted, or more commonly accepted, in just the same way as in historical periods. We've seen, lies about, I don't know, gay men, for example, being groomers and so on. I mean, the same sort of arguments are being recycled as we were addressing 20 years ago or 30 years ago around the whole HIV/AIDS crisis and so on, when that first erupted in the 80s and the 90s. It's the same, it's the same principle, really, it seems to me. Yeah.
But that's a perfect segue to that's a perfect segue to this question, which is, the transphobia industry, not the trans industry, the transphobia industry, when trans women and trans men are excluded from sports, when laws get passed that prohibit young people and children from getting the treatment they need to transition, or they are told you can only transition at age 18, or sometimes or sometime in your 20s. What does that, this may sound like a stupid question, but what does that say to the community, and what are the next steps then when when you have people, when you have a people, trans people, who who have already transitioned, but they still face intense social exclusion / marginalization?
Mm. Yeah, I was reading an article in Jacobin. I skimmed it earlier today, which was quite an interesting article on actually the US situation. One of the points it made was that a significant percentage of people, trans people who are out are finding themselves forced to detransition in certain states where it becomes almost impossible to live. I mean, Florida was was
Yeah,
the real kind of bête noire in the US. But people feeling that they have to kind of go back into the kind of closet of detransition or move states. Go to a state where there isn't this kind of legislative onslaught. I mean, things are in the UK in general. I mean, I've seen social media discussion where people are talking about leaving the UK because they see the writing on the wall in terms of the erosion of rights, the refusal to grant, to grant a level of existence really that's acceptable. And of course, you mentioned briefly, you kind of alluded to the hate crime figures, which are
yeah,
rising very significantly. For, even more significantly for trans people than for LGBT people. I mean, but we have seen here in the UK. I mean, there was a dreadful murder of a young trans woman, Brianna Ghey, back in February, and that led to very big vigils, in solidarity, and a lot of anger. And I mean, you in the US and North America, there are many more murders. I mean, the population's bigger, but actually there are many more murders.
there's an epidemic of hate crime against trans people,
Absolutely.
particularly trans, women of color, Black people, brown
Yeah.
people,
Yeah.
indigenous.
No, absolutely. That's the case, and that's the price really that the attacks, because this is not an academic argument. These attacks have words written or spoken or whatever have real consequences on people's lives. I mean, a few years ago there was a successful legal challenge in this country to young people getting puberty blockers. It was overturned later on appeal, but it left many young trans people and their families bereft and desperate overnight. This was overnight. This happened, and people were then saying, "Well, what do I do? Do I go on the black market? With all the risks that involves and the expense and so on and so forth." As I say, that particular one was overturned, but there are very clearly attacks on access to healthcare in the US, in a whole range of other countries, and in the UK. I mean, it's now the case that none of the gender identity clinics, of which there are only 7 in the UK, none of them are now taking new referrals, and if you do get referred at some point, the waiting list now is 4 to 5 years. Now, for a young person, if you're 8, 10, 12, 13 years old, you're coming up to puberty and you're told that your first appointment, just to get a referral to that clinic without any treatment, this is before any treatment or anything, is 4 to 5 years. That is devastating. And of course, the cost then is in relation to suicidality, self-harm, depression, etc., etc. This is the direct result of the kind of attacks, the transphobic attacks that we're seeing ramped up, now. But I do want to emphasise that the attacks, I think here and in the US, they are coming from the top. I know you're quite right. There are people on the liberal left and the left who have kind of gone along with these attacks, and sometimes part of gender critical myth making about trans people. But actually, it's very much, it is being driven from the top. It's being driven by, in this country, the Tories, in Hungary by Viktor Orban and his associates. It was very much driven by Trump, by Bolsonaro in Brazil. And that's why I do agree with you. I think it's very sad that there are some people on the left who've kind of gone along with this. When look at the company they're keeping. You know, uh, how could you?
Exactly.
You know, how could you
And
do that?
but 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 that leads to but that sort of leads to this question, which is many of the anti-trans laws that are you know went backwards. Let me read my handwriting. Yeah, so many of the anti-trans laws that are new, but even those that were already on the books in the West and others that engage in in transphobic actions, do a lot of those people like you mentioned like the Viktor Orbans of the world, the Bolsonaros of the world, but even those in the West, are a lot of them calling for conversion therapy of people who express that of people who express that they want to change their genders, or is that just the next step in the in the anti-trans laws we see? And because with the transphobic rabbit holes that the far right and others who harbor transphobics want to see advanced, none of them really even explain what exactly they want to do with trans people, but is that really what? But isn't that what they're more or less advocating? That that we have conversion therapy. That we have conversion therapy for people who express wanting to change their genders, and it also explain to people what that means when you send a trans person or somebody who's simply even expressing that they want to change their gender to a conversion therapist.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, it's not that long ago when people who, trans people who, particularly children who came out, were sent to mental institutions for some form of conversion therapy. I mean, there were all sorts of techniques, aversion therapy techniques, which were supposed to turn you off, from wanting to do this, to dress in the, quotes, the other gender, and so on and so forth. Really brutal stuff. Electroconvulsive therapy, and the less kind of medically invasive stuff, which is promoted by a whole bunch of religious institutions who want to kind of pray you out of being gay or trans or whatever it is. It's a notion that the trans person is sick. We tend to get accused of being mad, bad, or sick, really.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's so some people regard it on the right regard it as some form of mental illness, and of course it has been it has been classified as a mental illness up until very recently. The US actually got rid of transphobia as a mental illness, or being trans
Yeah.
as a mental illness some time before the British did. It's fairly recent, I think 1993 in the UK. It's actually been reclassified in some of the more hostile countries as a mental illness. I mean, in Russia, for instance, being trans is now not just kind of illegal, but actually it's classified as a mental illness, which means that your driving license is, a lot of trans people had their driving licenses taken away, because if you're mentally ill, you shouldn't have a driving license, should you? And that happened quite relatively recently, just a few years ago. And that's how this kind of creeping transphobia disenfranchises people. It's used throughout history, isn't it? I mean, we saw it the way in which Jews were progressively disenfranchised in the 1930s. You can see that sort of process happening, where you're banned from public places, you're banned from certain, taking part in certain things. Sport's a good example, which you mentioned earlier. I know. I mean, the world. I believe is it the World Chess Federation? I forget the proper name for it.
Yes.
Just decided to have a ban. Interestingly, actually, the UK Chess Federation has decided to ignore that ban. I mean, there is no justification.
But all the other ones they're keeping, right? All the other like sports exclusions
Yeah,
they're keeping, right? So,
yeah. No, absolutely.
yeah.
And that interestingly, that was the whole question of trans people in sport was identified as a particularly weak, a nerve to grab hold of in terms of attacking trans people generally, because most people, or many people, are susceptible to the argument that, well, how can it be right that people, men who, quotes, men who transition to be trans women, surely they're on average bigger, stronger, they have they keep some of the muscle strength. They're better prepared, etc., etc. That's a whole other argument. I don't agree with that argument, by the way, but it is an argument that's put very strongly on the basis of fairness. I mean, we have a transphobic organisation in the UK called Fair Play for Women, which is dedicated to driving trans people out of any kind of sport. Even, I don't know if you've got this in America.
But what baffles me is even after the person has fully transitioned. So in other words, the the person is a man now, the person is a woman now, and even then they still want to say, sorry, you cannot participate in basketball, football, tennis, or whatever variety games of the Olympics.
Or chess, or yes. I mean, it is bizarre. Even, I mean, a number of sporting bodies actually have kind of testosterone level criteria for taking part in competitions at kind of elite levels. I mean, whether weightlifting or whatever. I mean, the truth of it is, given those criteria, the Olympic sport is not sort of replete with trans women grabbing medals, all over the place. To my knowledge, it's a tiny, tiny number of trans people, competing at that sort of level. I mean, in the UK, there was even an attempt by a transphobic group quite recently to ban trans women from park run. I don't know if you have it in the US, but it's people go out recreationally for charity and do sort of 5 kilometers around a local park on a Saturday morning. There was an attempt to stop trans women taking part in that as women. I mean, it's kind of bizarre. And there's the whole series of attacks, particularly in the US, not so much at the moment in the UK, on trans children taking part in school sports. So that a couple of states, I think it's Texas and Florida, have now got legislation which actually allows for genital inspections of a child if they are suspected to be trans, and taking part in school sports on the basis of fairness. I mean, if that's not sexual abuse, I don't really know what is.
But then a quick follow up then, before we address some of those concerns that transphobic people have, then is what do the transphobes or what do the active transphobic person or the people who are who fall under the arguments of of the transphobe industry, like what do they want then from trans people? Do they just want that trans people simply do not even exist anymore, and anyone who, because it always starts with these small laws and then it escalates into not to use World War II language, but into like a final solution type of thing. So what do they want? Do they just want then that like that like anyone who expresses their their gender and expresses wanting to change their gender, that they just suppress that thing, get that out of your heads, otherwise you're going to see yourself in a mental institution and we're going to make life very much hard for yourself until you get this idea out of your head of wanting to change your gender? Is that what the long-term goal is of these right-wing bigots and whatnot?
Yeah, I think it's an eradication. What they want is an eradication of what they perceive as a threat. And what is it a threat to? It's a threat to heteronormativity. It's a threat to the nuclear family, perceived as. If you have head of the household, man, woman, 2 point whatever it is now, 1.9 children or whatever, that kind of ideology of what's normal comes under threat by all sorts of people living different sorts of lifestyles, of course, and different family structures, because you can have all sorts of families, informal, non-blood related families, and so on and so forth. All of those are seen as kind of threats to stability, normality, and so on. I mean, what drives the right? What drives the far right? Fundamentally, it's about race, it's about nation, it's about the family, and of course that's kind of underpinned by a great many different sorts of religious institutions and religious notions. Although it obviously has a secular aspect as well. So I think it's very much that. Whereas, kind of on the left, it seems to me what those of us on the left should be about prioritizing is class interests. That's much more fundamental than nations which come and go and are artificial entities essentially. Whereas, of course, social class, economic class isn't. It's a fundamental aspect of human experience and how we live our lives, how we produce things to live with. So I think it's the more extreme transphobes do, they would love to kind of physically do away with trans people. I think most others, the kind of broad right-wing elements, if you like, probably could live with just stopping trans people accessing the spaces that they've been used to, having legal rights to healthcare, etc., etc., and to marginalise. Keep a I mean, a marginalised group's very handy, isn't it? If you've got an economic crisis, you can point to all sorts of marginalised groups who are threatening your way of life. Using resources.
Even though it's the capitalist scumbag, which is actually the reason why everybody is, struggling. But
Exactly, yeah.
but then, okay, let's respond to some of the transphobes and some of the arguments. Those who claim not to be transphobe are just expressing concern. So regarding those who want to change their gender. So a fan of the show, and I think a past guest was saying to me that some of the drag queen story time performances have been too sexually explicit and not age appropriate for children under 13. If that is the case, do you think that the queer community needs to retire this strategy and find another method in terms of teaching tolerance to kids, about not being queer phobic? I'm curious your response to that.
Well, I think it's if that's the case is the key point there, because I don't think it is the case. There's certainly been I've seen on social media, the circulation of what would be clearly an inappropriate piece of behaviour by allegedly somebody who was engaged in, drag queen story hour. But that if that did occur, then that's something that you wouldn't endorse. I mean, obviously, people can say and do things at gay nightclubs and stuff, which they would not do. Nobody in their right mind would do to an
Exactly.
audience of kids. And as far as I know, that is, if it is an example, is one isolated example. I mean, people should talk to the parents who take their kids to see Drag Queen Story Hour,
Yeah.
and who universally, as far as I'm aware, say it's great fun, it's a good laugh. Kids join in, it's participation, and there's nothing kind of inappropriate that takes place. That's not nothing that isn't kind of age appropriate at all. No, it's a target, isn't it? Based on rumor and misunderstanding, and it reminds me of we used to have. I'm sure you I've forgotten her name. Who was the campaigner against LGBT rights in the 60s and 70s? I've forgotten her bloody name.
Anita uh,
Anita Bryant.
Anita
Anita
Bryant.
Bryant. Yeah. But I mean, we had Mary Whitehouse in the UK. I mean, she hadn't been to see a lot of the plays that she objected to because of their sexual or nudity or whatever. But she just knew that they were disgusting and inappropriate, and nobody else should see them. Luckily, that's kind of gone now. But there was decades of that stuff really, and this is a kind of moral panic, frankly, based on nothing. I make the point in the book, and I've made it wherever I get the opportunity, to be honest. But one of the things I don't argue very much with gender critics and so on, because it's a self-defeating exercise, frankly.
Like an atheist
Whether
talking to a religious person.
exactly, yeah,
They're
it
not,
does
they're
your
not
head
going
in.
to convert one another.
No, exactly, it does your head in, and I don't, I try and value my mental health to the extent that I don't want to do that, but nonetheless, it is possible to argue with people, but one of the arguments I have used with them is to say, well, show me some evidence. You say trans women are a danger in all sorts of ways to cisgender women, in toilets, in changing rooms, whatever it is. Give me an example. Give me some examples. Show me where this has happened. The evidence is just not there. There may be kind of one isolated example of somebody. There was one in Scotland uh, not that long ago that I came across, but that person, that trans person, was clearly kind of not very stable. Had
Yeah.
problems, had severe problems. What you don't do then is generalize to every trans person, and because that is the very definition of prejudice, isn't it? You don't. We anybody on the left ought to be alert to that and say, well, actually, that's not done. But the evidence simply is not there. Actually, these kind of what you call bathroom bans in the USA or public toilet bans in the UK, if they get them through here, all sorts of problems are. How are you going to police it? I mean, literally, how are you going to have? Are you going to have somebody on the
Well, actually,
door?
that's actually
You know what I mean?
that's a perfect segue to actually that was one of my questions, which is I actually don't have a very good answer when people say when people confront me, what do you do about the bathroom? So actually talk to our audience. How do we deal with that? With the issue of
Yeah,
changing rooms and and public toilet facilities.
yeah. Well, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that some of the people who suffer most and are put in most danger, obviously, trans people are put in most danger, but one of the groups that um, suffers from this kind of public toilet ban is actually cisgender women who don't conform appropriately to sexual stereotypes, to gender stereotypes, who have got short hair, are tall, are wearing trousers, all those kind of things, and that you can go onto social media and find loads of examples of cis women who have been challenged and have found themselves at the sharp end of this kind of attempt to police who goes into a public toilet. I mean, it's bizarre, actually, isn't it? I mean, toilets have separate cubicles. I mean, what people do in those cubicles is up to them. But I mean, it's what you want to go for a pee, you go in, you go in there. What's the big issue? But I think they haven't thought this stuff through, because what would what would gain you entry? I mean, would you have to would you have to carry your birth certificate if you're a trans person? Would it be acceptable if you've had gender reassignment surgery? And you've got a gender recognition certificate? Is that a criterion for acceptance into a women's toilet? Or how would you ascertain this? Like I say, would you have somebody on the door saying you look like a trans person, so I'm not going to let you in. You look okay. Many trans women have gone stealth, integrated for decades, and you simply would not know that they were trans. Similarly, with many trans men, you would not know that the person you're talking to or the person you're interacting with is a trans man.
Or even
you know,
intersex for that matter.
or intersex, exactly, or whatever their sexuality is, as well as their gender identity. So I just, it's kind of, it is bizarre, but they have made some advances, the transphobes, on this, because for example, the prison regulations were changed in the UK relatively recently. So now you used to be on a one-to-one risk assessed basis, you could potentially be sent as a remand prisoner or a sentenced prisoner to a prison, the prison estate that suits your, is appropriate to your gender presentation. That's changed now after a couple of highlighted cases, so that even if you have a gender recognition certificate as a trans person, you're going to get sent to the prison estate that is originally on your birth certificate. So trans women are now
So so
being
so so
sent to
so,
men's
so,
prisons.
so that's very important to know. So even if somebody has fully transitioned to man or woman, fully transitioned, they're not post operation, but just fully transitioned. If they whatever are convicted for whatever crime, even if they have fully transitioned, that woman is going to be in a men's facility. That man is going to be in a woman's facility.
Yes, that's the current position. Yeah, yeah. It's pretty shocking. And of
Wow.
course, it puts them at enormous danger. So very often they have to apply to be kept in solitary or in a special unit. Um, and there aren't that many trans prisoners, to be honest. So the chances of having separate facilities for trans, generally trans prisoners, trans remand prisoners, or whatever, it's the same argument. I've read a couple of many articles and a couple of books where like Kathleen Stock's book, for instance, where she says, I've got nothing against trans people. I don't hate them. I just want them to have separate facilities. Well, really, in the current circumstances, what do separate prisons? Well, separate whole series of separate public toilets for trans people. I mean, not only do you out yourself going into that, but where's the money coming from?
I mean, but if one is interested in smashing heteronormativity, would we need then just like a facility for all trans people who are who are beginning to transition, and then those who come out as non-binary? To which, okay, like I can sort of understand that argument, but for me, it's like if a person identifies as woman and they're going through that operation, if a person identifies as men and they're going through that operation, and the operation is done, I I don't give a shit about whatever biological arguments people want to have, but that person is a man now. That person is a woman now. So let them get on with their lives and go in
Yeah.
whatever facility. I'm curious. I'm curious.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's absolutely the case. I mean, it seems to me an absolutely basic tenet of any socialist. There are certain basic principles, it seems to me. One is that you stand in solidarity with any oppressed group, all oppressed groups and any oppressed groups. And that includes very clearly trans people, tiny minority of society, probably around about 1% or so. But, actually, as we've already discussed earlier, massively marginalized and excluded and attacked and under current circumstances. That I think is very, 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 really, really a crucial point. The second crucial point seems to me is that we should support people's bodily autonomy, right to bodily autonomy, people's right to identify as they wish, and to respect that identity. And therefore, I think anybody on the left should regard a trans person as what they say they are. If a trans woman is a woman, a trans man is a man. If you're non-binary, actually that is a perfectly kind of normal, worthy of respect identity. It seems to be, and a lot of people don't have a problem accepting that, particularly younger people. I mean, there was quite
Also,
a large
there is
survey.
hope for humanity then.
Yeah, I know. I'm not. I know people do. I know lots of trans people who are quite despairing and not just frightened, but despairing in the current situation. I don't see it as bad as that because I look at the way in which trans people and supporters have come out in solidarity to defend drag queen tourists, drag queen story hour. The numbers of people going on trans pride marches has increased in London. The last trans pride march in London just a month or so ago had 30,000 people on it, and a lot of trade union banners. I mean, I think it's really important, not just because I spent time as a trade union activist, but actually building links between, trans organizations, trans community, and the trade union movement, because it's in the workplaces often that the discrimination takes place, and you need strong organization, in those workplaces to stand up for trans people. You need the solidarity. If somebody's, been sacked or harassed, they need people to stand with them. They need people to walk out if necessary. And there are good examples of people doing that, which have kind of overturned those kind of attacks. So I'm not without hope. That, for example, in the question of self-ID, there are something like 20, I think it's about 27 countries or legislatures now, which actually have incorporated self-IDs, self-recognition, including Ireland, by the way. Ireland has a very similar Gender Recognition Act to the UK, except that they introduced self-ID to their Gender Recognition Act in 2015, and there have been no problems. Nobody's been disciplined for wrongly claiming a gender recognition certificate in order to get into women's spaces. No, but there's been no issue. Countries like Spain have just done this, Argentina, Denmark, a whole series of other countries. So what you're getting is a kind of polarity where some countries are kind of moving forward on the issue, and other countries dominated by the right and the populist authoritarians and so on have become far worse.
But then I'm curious. Before we, before you address, the whole issue of, some of the transphobic arguments and some of the concerns about the medication one takes to transition. You already talked about, about the prison, facilities, and so can you further respond to the constant argument and horror story that TERFs and other transphobes often constantly bring up about the predator who's not a fully transitioned criminal who sexually assaults female in prisons, and therefore this specific kind of criminal should be in a male prison, and they're faking their gender dysmorphia in order to easily be predators towards women. And I'm curious your response on that, because I have a response also to make on that, but I'm curious, your response to that.
Yeah, I think I don't think you can have a blanket position on that. I mean, there have been a couple of cases, quite notorious cases in the UK. One about 4 years ago, where a trans prisoner who was actually in prison for assaulting women, cisgender women, went on in prison to carry out, I think, 2 more assaults on women, cisgender women. And there was another case in Scotland relatively recently, a few months ago, where a similar thing happened. And the problem in both of those cases was a problem of risk assessment. Every prisoner is supposed to be risk assessed. What sort of risk do you pose to other prisoners in that institution? What sort of risk do you pose to yourself? Are you at risk of suicide attempts and so on? And clearly, that didn't work properly in these cases. And you had people. I mean, I'm not here to say every trans person is a paragon of virtue, is completely sane, is never a violent person or whatever. I mean, trans people are people, and people are all sorts of people, and some are not nice, but most are fine, like any group of people.
Yeah.
And I think it's a failure of the individual risk assessment in those circumstances. The problem is people take a kind of sledgehammer to crack a nut, and it's all trans people have now suffered, actually, in relation to the prison regulations, because of the mistakes made with a couple of unfortunate and clearly unwell trans prisoners. So that would be my kind of response to that, I
Yeah,
think.
and I wanted to because I often hear this. I hear this a lot from people, and when writing down my questions, I actually made this note to myself, which is if people are if people really do care about the safety of women prisoners, they actually would be demanding defunding the police, defunding the prisons, because people because most of the people most of the prisoners, a majority of prisoners, whether it's in a female prison or a male prison, the people who sexually assault them are actually the people in authority. It could be the prison guard. It could be some kind of some kind of an authority figure, mostly male, but male or female. And for me, okay, so if if there was if there was a trans person, whether they fully transitioned or not, who committed a hideous act of violence, okay, that person should be okay. That person, should be, should be punished and whatnot. But that doesn't mean that you paint a huge broad brush and recycle things like like you must have heard of the whole model minority. Like, why would we do that to a whole group of people? Okay, so if a person committed a crime, okay, and outside or inside a prison, okay, that person will be dealt with. But why? I just don't understand how leftists could then paint a broad brush of amongst an entire community with people and demand that like all trans people have to be these wonderful law abiding people, and if one trans person commits this crime in a prison and stuff like that, then the entire community needs to be collectively punished. I just find that bizarre. That's like people who say that like all immigrants have to be law abiding and like model immigrants and whatnot. I'm curious your response to that.
No, I agree with that, Youri. Absolutely. I was. I should have probably mentioned. I mean, a few years ago, 2019, I think it was, there were four suicides of all trans women in UK prisons. I was actually part of a picket outside a local prison to us at Doncaster, where one of those prisoners had been housed. And I agree with you. I mean, it raises, there's a whole series of broader questions here, aren't there, about defunding the police, which is raised by the whole kind of Black Lives Matter movement. And should people be in prison? Well, actually, most people know they shouldn't be in prison. There are ways of dealing with, not retribution, in fact, but there are ways of dealing with unacceptable behaviour which don't involve incarceration, and particularly in the US, incarceration in the prison industrial military complex,
Exactly.
because it's vast numbers in prison in the US, aren't there? No, I agree with you. I think that's right.
Yeah, and I mean, and actually talk about the conditions of trans people in prisons, those who aren't fully transitioned and those who are, and how it's actually, when it comes to sexual assaults, it's actually they are the ones that are more at risk from gender conforming cisgender prisoners, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Uh, that's, I think, a kind of well documented, uh, situation. I mean, there are kind of a lot of myths here as well, aren't there, about the nature of women's prisons, that somehow there's a kind of an odd sort of quasi-feminist narrative that women are not or can't be violent. You know,
Yeah.
come on, really. Um, that's a non. It's true, of course, that most violence against women is committed by men. Absolutely, this is one of the ironies of the whole kind of gender critical movement, that they will campaign around, you know, unacceptable behaviour by a trans prisoner somewhere, but they're not campaigning about women in prison generally. Why are they there? because of poverty, by and large, having to steal or sell their bodies or whatever. They don't actually. I mean, it's if you look at you look at their websites, they don't actually campaign for women's rights. They campaign against trans rights,
certainly
but
not
not
even
for women's rights.
and certainly not female prisoners' rights. You mean as well?
No, no, exactly.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. And then, but then respond then to some of the concerns that some people have about the medication and the treatments, particularly teens and undertake. Some claim that that's too dangerous. Transitioning and that the medication that people take to transition is far too dangerous. And of course, then you have the big conspiracy theory that transgenderism, that this is a Trojan horse of big evil big pharma to and the industry of transgenderism to prey upon prey upon the young people and like mutilate their
Yeah.
bodies. You're you're
Well,
spot
if it was about if it was about building industry and big pharma, you'd think that they would allow much greater access for trans people, particularly younger trans people, to those medications, rather than keep them away and actually encourage them to go on the black market to get non-generic medication. I guess that's a bit of an aside, but there are two. People need to be aware. There are two broad kinds of medication that trans people might be seeking. One of them is cross-sex hormones, estrogen-based in HRT essentially, which has the impact that people hope it has, which bodily changes, actually rather more changes for trans men, trans men than for sometimes for trans women, particularly if they transition later on in life. But those are the cross-sex hormones. The other area is what's called puberty blockers, which have been a source of great misinformed debate for a long time. The sort of gender critics and the transphobes say these are untested, they're being used experimentally on children. They've not been properly examined and tested and so on over the decades, blah blah blah. Actually, it's not true. The drugs actually have been thoroughly tested, because they've been in use for a long time. They've been in use as puberty blockers for people, kids who are going through very early puberty, at sort of ages of 4 and 5 or 6 or whatever, in order to slow that down, and put them in the kind of, if you like, the normal range of when people go through puberty. So it's not true that they're experimental. There is no evidence that that kind of medication is harmful. There's a whole series of reputable, peer-reviewed studies that indicate that there is no serious long-term harm. Plus, of course, young people are generally not on this kind of medication for very long. If you jump through all the hoops,
interesting. Okay.
and yeah, I mean, supposing you're 10 or something and you come out and your parents don't kick you out of the house, don't try and convert you, and you get some access to a gender clinic, you might be prescribed those the puberty blocking medication as a means to give you a breathing space, so that you can avoid, the onset of puberty, if it's a trans boy, growth of breasts, etc., etc., all the kind of biological changes that take place. If you're a trans woman aspiring to be a trans woman later on in life, your voice breaking, bodily hair, changes to body mass, and so on and so forth. That's kind of put on hold. It gives people that breathing space where they may choose to then, if they can, go forward with cross-sex hormones and all the other, potentially the other kind of aspects of affirming their gender identity, or they may choose not to. And some people choose not to, but they
So
can choose
so
that
so
in
so so
in a
so
position where they're on hold.
so a quick follow-up to that is it's actually a very slow, arduous process, which so it's a very slow process, but that also gives time. I mean, if the person comes out, very young in life, it gives them at least some time to think. Okay, are you sure you really want to go through with changing your gender?
Essentially, yes. Yes, and I mean, some people may decide that it's not for them. I don't. By the way, I don't have any problem with people detransitioning. If that's what people choose, they should be supported in that decision. Having said that, by the way, um, the studies of detransitioners that have taken place, it's a very small number, by the way. It's probably something like less than 5%, between 1% and 5%. The vast majority of those people who detransition do so for social reasons, not because they've decided they're not trans or non-binary. It's because they're under so much pressure that they feel that they can't pursue the transition. And many of them actually subsequently later on do go back and transition. But the other thing people need to be aware of is that, I mean, I'm sure it's probably the same elsewhere, but in the UK, nobody gets access to um, gender affirming surgery until they're 18 at least 18. Nobody gets cross sex
Wow.
hormones until they're at least 16. So, there are all sorts of myths abound which sort of say, kids are being operated on or being given cross-sex hormones at 10 years old and so on. It's not actually the case. That is not happening.
What
And there is a very big
and
positive as well. Sorry, if I can just say that there's a very big positive to the
that
puberty blocking medication, which the studies suggest that the rate of suicide of young people on who have access to puberty blocking medication is 73% lower than those who don't get access to it. So, it's not just about whether or not there may be kind of deleterious physical changes, but actually what happens to their state of mind as well, and how does that address mental well-being? And for many parents, the worst nightmare possible is that your kid becomes so frustrated and so despairing that they attempt and possibly succeed in suicide.
exactly. But that said, this wasn't a question I wasn't on planning on asking, but the people who support a person who changes their gender only when they're this magical age of 18 or only when they're this magical age of their 20s. I mean, do they not understand that you're that's okay that that a person who does come out wanting to change their gender, do they not understand do they not just understand like the huge emotional turmoil they're putting somebody through? Because take somebody like Jenner, like Caitlyn, Caitlyn Jenner. I mean, you can avoid those sort of situations, and those situations do happen when somebody decides to come out very late in life and then change their gender. You could avoid all of that stuff if you just allow the person however young in age to then already transition. But of course, I understand again that that's hard for people to wrap their heads around because we do live in a very, very heteronormative binary society. So I'm curious your response on that before I get to my two last questions.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's right. It's the trouble is you can't. Not every trans person is the same, and not every trans person's life history and life story is the same. Obviously, some people. I mean, it is generally. broadly speaking, much easier now to come out than it was when I was very young. I mean, the only role models I could think about or look towards back in the 60s was April Ashley, who was famous, unfortunately, famous court case that actually set trans rights back by 30 years as it happened. Um,
Uh-huh.
but yes, because prior to that case, by the way, trans people in the UK could change their birth certificates, and some did get married as well. Um, and unfortunately, the April Ashley case, not her fault at all, but set that back. The outcome of that reactionary judge's verdict, set it back. So not everybody's the same. It is potentially easier now because people have got their internet, they've got many more role models, and particularly amongst young people, and at schools and so on. A lot more people, much more gender fluid, much more willing to. I mean, queer. When I was, in the 60s, queer was a term of vile abuse. It's been kind
Yeah.
of reclaimed by many people now as as a something that empowers them and gives a sense of community and so on. Yeah, I've kind of lost myself on that question, but I think it is easier now. People's rights should be respected, whether they choose to go through transition and what extent that transition. Some people are not bothered, by the way, about being considered or recognized even as trans rather than as a woman or a man. They say, I am trans. I am not, I'm not a woman. I'm sort of binary. I'm not into that kind of binary classification either.
Yeah.
So I regard myself as trans or non-binary or whatever term suits them. And people should. What's wrong with just
Go ahead. Go
respecting
ahead. Go
people's
ahead.
decisions?
Go ahead.
Well, that seems to me that's that's the way we should respect everybody's right to self-identify and so on.
It is
That's
it is unbelievable, but uh, two last questions before we get to the questionnaire is this then, which is do you think we'll ever live in a time where heteronormativity and transphobia, if it's not entirely vanquished, but it's strongly pushed back against, and if not, and if not, given the state of affairs and so much of the straight cisgender left engaging in transphobia, do you think we'll see a rise of 2S LGBTQIA folks and tolerant families either build alternative schools or homeschool their children in order to shield them from the bullying and the queer phobia that that exists? And given your background in education, I'm now even more fascinated in your response to that question.
Well, yes, we probably are likely to see that, I suspect, but that is a problem in some respects in itself, isn't it? Because it's an indictment of the system that we live in. If you can't, you know, it's a part. In a way, it's kind of harks back to the old arguments, isn't it? Around, do you change yourself, or do you change the society in which you live? If you don't fit in,
Oh wow, yeah.
Which, I mean, I will defend people who hold identity theories, whether into whatever that might be, queer theory or privilege theory or whatever. Their right to hold that, particularly when their rights are being attacked by the right. I think any socialist should stand in solidarity with people, even we don't. I personally wouldn't agree with them. I mean, I'm a Marxist. I don't agree with identity theory. But I think it's that argument about, well, is it better to change yourself? Well, actually, the reality is you do change yourself by trying to change the society that you live in, and the kind of two go hand in hand, it seems to me. So I'm not sure that's engaging totally with the question. I would rather see people fighting within the system for their rights within the education system as it exists, rather than taking kids out in order to protect them. Though I can perfectly well understand why people might want to do that, because the system can be absolutely brutal to minorities.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
uh, having
because recently, I don't know if it's in New Brunswick or Saskatchewan, but one of the provinces in Canada, there's this argument of when a kid comes out as trans or non-binary and then wanting to change their pronouns, does the school alert the parents and so forth? So
yeah,
so now it comes to this whole issue about like, well, what about like the parents? Parents should know when if their kid.
yeah,
Of course, the counter argument is that hey, if a person, well, hey, this kid is probably afraid to come out to their parents because their parents probably are, transphobic or by and large, heteronormative and very queer phobic. So it's now this huge, controversy. And when I see, when I read stuff like this, hear stuff like this, I think to myself, wow, the society is not, progressing. And a friend of mine, she's an advocate of of homeschooling, and says like the situation is getting worse and worse. So if I have a queer child, I don't want them to go through any of that,
yeah.
BS. So I'm curious your response.
No, I can understand how the motivation. I can understand it, even though, as I say, I think it's better, broadly speaking, to fight to change the system. I mean, this is a live. You mentioned Saskatchewan. I mean, this is a issue currently in the UK because the Tories have. They haven't actually done it yet, but they keep threatening to put out new guidelines for schools and teachers, which would make it an offence in schools for teachers or schools not to inform parents if a kid comes out as as gay. I mean, which many kids do, where their first point of contact is a sympathetic teacher, somebody who themselves might be LGBT, and they talk to them, and it's putting the pressure on the teachers to then tell the school management to then tell the parents, even though the parents may be homophobic and so on. Now, that hasn't actually come out yet, but it's certainly something that Rishi Sunak's government has been floating, for a while. And of course, that puts real pressure on the teachers, because if you don't conform to that, will you then be subject to disciplinary procedure, which then brings in the question of the trade union, and is your trade union going to stand by you? Um, I mean, the whole issue of transphobia has been quite an issue within the main teachers union here for some years.
Oh, so
Some of the
like
founders.
so there's a rift between those who are queer liberationists and those who yeah who are bigoted, particularly towards
Well,
trans people.
yeah, I mean, the unions, just about every union has a pro-trans position, which is great. And every time the issue comes up at conferences, delegates pretty much overwhelmingly vote for trans rights and so on. But
Well,
there are
that's
people
great to
within
hear.
those
That's
trade
reassuring to
unions.
hear.
There are people within the trade union. I mean, a couple of the organisers of some of the gender critical groups here are actually were senior officials in one or two of the trade unions, the civil service trade union and the teachers trade union. And so there's been big rows, within the union hierarchies, if you like, about what they've been doing. But back to your original question, which was, I do think it's better to try and change the world, because that question about, do I think, am I hopeful about change and stopping the attacks? Well, broadly speaking, yes, but only if our side gets organised. It's change always comes from below, real change, doesn't it? And people
Yeah,
organising themselves below, and I think that's absolutely kind of fundamental. Do I think that trans rights can always be can be protected indefinitely inside capitalism? And the answer is no. We face, enormous crises. Where you look at it, existential crises around the environment, you know, climate change, and so on and so forth, as well as kind of looming and very serious economic crisis. Standard of living, people having awful trouble just paying for food, and all this kind of stuff. These crises occur. When they do, that's when they ramp up. They ramp up the attacks on migrants, refugees, trans people, etc., etc. All the time the system exists as it does, I think there's always that potential when it runs into problems and difficulties of attacking, the minority groups and working class people in general. So fundamentally, I think my bottom line there is we have to change the society. We need a socialist society. There's no two ways. You can't go around the bushes on this one. We need a socialist society which people are respected for who they are, and where actually nobody kind of gives a toss whether you're trans or cis or black
Intersect
or
or
white
not,
or
yeah,
Jewish or whatever. You know, they give as much toss about that as what your eye color is. Well, but that has to be fought for. That's the thing.
It is sad though that it just always seems as if we're always one step forwards and three steps backwards. And but my second but then my second last question is in order to get it but my second last question is it's this is what can what can my people do? How can straight leftists how can straight gender conforming leftists like myself or anyone who abhors transphobia and bigotry to others in the in the queer community, what can we do to help and be better allies? Because some of us, and you know what, I'm going to be honest, I even include myself in this. We often can be very cowardly when in terms of calling out transphobia and queerphobia to our friends, co-workers, family and acquaintances. So yeah, so I'm curious your response to that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't tend to talk in terms of using the term allies. It's not part of my vocabulary. I think solidarity is fundamental, and the reason solidarity makes sense is because something I said much earlier, which is that actually it is in the direct interests of working class people to stand against any oppression, include it's in their real material interests to stand against any oppression, whether that's racism or anti-Semitism. Because if you don't, you're kind of allowing the devisers, to get their way and to drive wedges between people, which makes it more easier for them. It makes them more secure in their position. It makes us less likely to be able to combine in ways that can seriously threaten their control and their rule. So that's why it's in our direct, the direct interests of all. But I think also what can be done. Actually, it is down to things like supporting, making sure that your trade union, if you're in a trade union, has got a pro-trans policy, that your workplace has got a pro-trans policy, and treats trans people, non-binary people with respect. And also when it comes to those things that, as you quite rightly said, Youri, it is very difficult sometimes, when somebody in your circle, whatever it is, makes a comment, tells a joke that they think is hilarious, that actually is appalling. You sometimes do just have to bite the bullet, and say, actually, I'm not going along with that. That's
Yeah.
not acceptable. And actually, you can lose friends, of course, about this. I've had to defriend a whole bunch of people who are broadly on the left and on many issues appear to be okay, anti-racist and so on and so forth. And then they'll post something transphobic, and generally speaking, I'll just unfriend them, and say how disappointed I am. I don't think it. I don't know about the US, but and North America generally, but in the UK, it's not a majority of the left which is transphobic at all. It's clearly a minority, very clearly, and it's actually a minority of feminists as well. Most feminists are not transphobic. You know,
So
there's a subset which is.
it might just seem like the outsider, somebody who doesn't live in England, or even somebody who might even live in England. So it just seems as if it is very vocal because such and such a leftist is engaging in transphobia and is going on to transphobic platforms and whatnot. But in general, as you mentioned, that no, by and large, the left is, does know how to chew gum and walk at the same time. Certainly, the Socialist Workers Party, and there are some positions, with them, mainly on foreign policy, but more of an ideological outlook. Anyways, there are some things, with the SWP that that I might have, I might have disagreements, but generally, when it comes to anti-imperialism, when it comes to sexism, when it comes to racial justice issues, when it comes to queer liberation, particularly on defending the T and LGBTQIA plus, SWP is a great example of largely straight allies, that are standing up for trans people, right?
No, absolutely. I mean, when I came out, I mean, I was already quite a long-standing member of the SWP, but I kind of came out in the early, more publicly, I guess, in the early 2000s, and I've had nothing but complete support and encouragement, as have lots of other trans people in the SWP. I mean, there are you're right. There are some kind of smaller organisations which are kind of not very good, and there is a tradition, I have to say, unfortunately, on the left, particularly kind of the Stalinist left, where the argument has been, well, this is all identity politics. We don't want anything to do with it. Let's concentrate on, pay and pensions and conditions at work, and leave all that other stuff till after the revolution, kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah,
Which
yeah, yeah.
is
Exactly.
or even worse, that it's kind of it's deviationism. It's middle class deviation from the class struggle. Which is that was that. I mean, it's bizarre, isn't it? Because when you look back, actually, the Russian Revolution, one of the first things they did within 2 months of that revolution was they decriminalized homosexuality. 2 months after the revolution, 50 years ahead of the UK, the capitalist UK in 1967.
Yeah.
Now, yes, that was, and actually they were very sympathetic and supportive to. They weren't necessarily called trans people then, but that people with with a gender identity issue, if you like. And of course, in Germany, I mean, it always was then the left which was associated not just with fighting for women's rights and against anti-Semitism, but actually for gay rights as well. You think of people like Edward Carpenter and folk like that. It was the left organisations by and large which were campaigning around those sorts of issues, and they put it into practice. Straight after it got overturned, didn't it, by Stalin, and it was recriminalized and so on. And there was that horrible tradition of back to the family, women having loads of kids, etc., etc. And it had to be
Romania as
fought
well.
for again.
Romania as well under Ceausescu. He was, he had very, very backward views when it came to reproductive rights and so forth. But that just goes to show you that, in order for somebody like me not to feel despair, or anybody on the left who is, who is depressed when we do witness transphobia, isn't that just like, look, this is just another struggle, us continuing struggles though from us continuing to wage struggles of the past of fight against heteronormativity, but even sexism that that does exist across the left, and even those who do harbor bigoted views when we talk about race and immigration and whatnot, then, right?
But I think it's also that it's wrong politics on the left. It's faulty understanding. It's a faulty understanding of the nature of materialism, for instance. That arguing that somehow gender identity isn't a material thing, it's not a real thing. It's kind of just something imaginary or whatever. It doesn't have reality. But it's also a fundamentally mistaken understanding of sex and sex essentialism. You see it on the left a lot, and the starting point, is of those who have gone down this kind of rabbit hole. Sex is immutable. Sex is about biology. Well, sex is not just about biology, actually. It's also political. It's also very intimately linked with I know, distinguishable conceptually, gender and sex, of course, but it is linked with social, political aspects as well. And it's not simple, it's complex, it's a complex phenomenon. The more we understand about sex, biological sex, we realize it's not simple and binary. And people, there are some people who've just gone down, swallowed the ideology of, the gender binary whole, and can't see their way out of it. And as I say, it isn't a majority of the left, but there are certainly, a few organisations on the left in the UK who've kind of got it wrong, frankly. And are on the wrong side of history. Any leftist who thinks that, who puts them on the same side as Trump and Orban and the Proud Boys and the various fascist groups in this country on the question of campaigning around Drag Queen Story Hour or swallows that kind of propaganda. In my book, is not a leftist at all, frankly.
Exactly, and I'll just one final thing I'll also say is that I think it just I'll say this to to the people, for those who simply can't get their head around around transgenderism or even non-binaryism and and intersex, the others, and when we talk about the LGBTQIA plus community, I mean, all I can say to them is, look, you don't have to get it. Just don't just don't be an asshole, I guess. Just like don't go out of your way to like marginalize other people. Just don't go out of your way to marginalize other people. And if you
Yeah.
and even then and even then, just I don't know, just stick to your lane, stick to the anti-imperialism work you do or the workers' rights you do, but just don't engage in being a bigoted person, which is what you know and somebody I know dear to me who just does not get transgenderism, and when we got into a polite argument about it, she was saying to me, well, listen, I don't understand it. I'm probably never going to understand it, but I don't want to marginalize these people, and I don't want to go out of my way to marginalize them. To which I said, hey, if you cannot, if you've already reached that position, okay, then we can have like a conversation. But if you are going to go out of your way to marginalize the people, and then that's where that's certainly where I draw the line with anyone and everyone.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And sometimes people can be won away from kind of gender critical ideas. Again, you can find examples of this, people sort of saying, I'm really sorry, I got it wrong. And there are a number of articles like that. So I wouldn't want to give up on people, particularly if they've got a decent kind of bedrock of socialist understanding and understanding not just how we're exploited as workers, but how we're oppressed, and that's fundamental. And I think a socialist has to have a good understanding of oppression, where it comes from, and if you like, how to fight it. Because the truth of it is, you can be black, you can be a woman. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be anti-sexist or anti-racist. There is no natural unity of the oppressed, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Even though you might think, if somebody, if you're oppressed, can you have a bit of empathy with other people? But it doesn't work quite like that, does it?
But we have to keep on fighting, and we have to keep on and we have to keep on struggling. All right. Now, before I let you go, Miss Miles, we usually
solidarity.
Now, before
right?
I let you go, Ms. Miles, we usually end the program doing the questionnaire, which was first done by Marcel Proust, later the popular French broadcaster Bernard Pivot, and perfected by my hero, the late great James Lipton of Inside the Actors Studio. Ms. Miles, it's your turn to do this. Ms. Miles, what is your
Lovely.
favorite? What is your favorite words?
My favorite word or works.
Favorite words. WRD. Favorite words.
Oh gosh. Um, my partner tells me that I say no a lot. I start sentences with no, which is maybe a an indication of um, I don't know, arrogance or ego. Um,
Some
Solidarity is my favorite word is solidarity, I guess. The one I think is absolutely fundamental to humanity.
then what is your least favorite words?
Oh gosh. Um, I suppose I, the one that really runs that rile me are, that fascism sets off an awful lot in my head, as does, of course, other words like the Holocaust and things like that. Um, another unfavorite is Tory. Um, uh, Sends shivers down my spine. Tory.
Then what turns you on creatively, spiritually, emotionally, or psychologically? What turns you on?
What turns me on spiritually?
Yeah,
Gosh.
creatively, spiritually, emotionally, or psychologically, what turns you on?
Oh, mostly, I guess, music. I would say. Um,
Great. Oh,
you
great
know,
answer. Yeah. Then in that case, then what turns you off then?
um, bad music. No. Um, what turns me off? I don't. Oh gosh, that's a really difficult one, isn't it? I think. I think boring in being in boring situations or listening to boring people, which you're very far from being, Yuri, uh, is
Yeah,
something that it just switches me off.
yeah, I know what you mean when you're in certain social situations and kind of everybody is like talking about like money this and then money that or the stock market this, the stock
Yeah,
market that,
yeah,
and it's like, oh my gosh, somebody please save me. So that kind of thing.
yeah, absolutely, yeah, yeah.
then then well, you've mentioned music twice, but then what sound or noise do you love? I assume still music, right?
Yeah, I do, but as I get older, I'm coming to value the sound of the natural world, actually. Water, birds singing, that sort of thing. Um, uh,
Interesting, interesting.
yeah, I get.
Then what sound or noise do you dislike then?
Oh gosh, I hate the noise of traffic in the background. Uh, Unfortunately, I live quite near a motorway, and you can never get away from it. The rush of cars and lorries and stuff. I detest it, really do.
It's
And
terrible.
I guess there are some voices
And
that that grate.
what profession, if you actually, you're retired, but you're still doing quite a lot of left activism and writing great books. But so if you weren't doing that, what profession would you like to have done?
Oh, I really regret not having learned music properly when I was much younger. I've only taken up the guitar in about the last few years, really, and I wish I'd done it when I was a kid. You know,
Then and then
uh,
and then what profession would you absolutely not want to do under any circumstances?
um, I could. I don't think I could ever be a vet. Uh, um,
Okay.
I would find it. I love animals. I've got animals and so on, but actually, um, particularly having to put animals to sleep. I think I'd find that really, 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 really difficult.
Because of how distressed the animal is, of even just trying to like calm them down as try to.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I just think I think as I approach my own mortality, I'm more protective of other creatures' mortality, and I just hate to see things die, I suppose.
I can
I've
imagine.
recently taken up being a vegan as well, so yeah.
My friend Trish faint signals of a vegan. She would be very proud of you. She's a very proud queer
All
liberationist,
right, there you go.
and is a huge advocate of animal rights and veganism. So she would be very proud of you in that respect. Then the final one: if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say as you arrive at the pearly gates, or whatever is your vision of the afterlife? And even if you're an atheist or an agnostic, please please,
Gosh,
sir.
I think yes. If God greeted me with saying, "Would you like another go at it and do it better this time round?" I'd think that would be great.
So you'd be completely open to the idea of like reincarnation
Oh
and
yes, why not?
really.
Yeah.
So all of the struggles you've had in your life, if you could sort of do it all again, definitely wouldn't mind. Or well, not everything.
Oh, I think yeah. We all make mistakes, don't we? And not that my transition was a mistake, but we all make mistakes in our lives and things I regret. I'm sure everybody does. I wish I was wise enough at the start to not having done them in the first place. So,
Well, well, we were joined on this edition of One Plus One, our all things queer liberation, with Laura Miles, the author of the author of sorry, the author of Transgender Resistance, Socialism, and the Fight for Trans Liberation. She's associated with the Socialist Workers Party and a long time union activist and queer liberation leftist. Miss Miles, thank you so much for for coming on and allowing me to speak to you. And I just have to say solidarity forever to the 2S LGBTQIA plus community, especially at T. And given the sick current state of affairs, power to the people and debt to heteronormativity. And I hope that this will be the first of many conversations we have both on and off the air when it comes to not just fighting back and pushing back against transphobia, but other topics.
thanks, Youri. Thanks for the invitation. Thoroughly enjoyed the discussion. Thank you.
Likewise, thank you so much.